A man hands over his passport, flawless, polished, and completely wrong. Welcome to Detective Echoes, I am your host Kyle. This community is amazing, comment below and tell me where you're watching from today. I treasure every response I get from you. Let's begin. The soft rain had been falling since dawn, the kind that blurs the outlines of the city until everything looks slightly smudged, buildings, people, even time itself. Chief Inspector Maigret sat motionless in a wooden-backed chair beside the stove in his small office at Quai d'Orfèvres. The warmth of the cast-iron belly had long since faded, but he didn't bother feeding it. He wasn't cold. He wasn't anything, really, just suspended. A half-finished letter to Madame Maigret lay on the corner of his desk. He had started it before breakfast, a little note about the butcher near Boulevard Voltaire who had finally reopened after his hip operation. Nothing important. He'd thought it might amuse her. She liked small details like that. But the words had dried up after 3 lines, and now the ink had turned gray at the tip of his pen. Across the city, in a corridor smelling faintly of wax and train smoke, a telegram waited with his name on it. It had arrived at the Gare d'Austerlitz half an hour ago, handed from one sleepy railway clerk to another, then set aside in a metal tray labeled Service Intérieur. A station agent named Fortin finally brought it by motorcycle, still in his blue cap and damp cape. Maigret opened the folded slip slowly, his fingers brushing the rough edge of the paper. It wasn't from the prefecture, nor a summons from the examining magistrate. Just a short message, unsigned, a man arrived from Milan. Everything in order. Too much in order. There was no address, no date, no sender. Just that. Maigret turned the paper over. Blank. He sat with it for a long time. It didn't demand attention, this message. It barely asked for it. But something in the phrasing, too much in order, pressed softly on a button somewhere inside him. It was the kind of phrase someone uses when they don't have facts. When they have a feeling. The room smelled of tobacco and damp wool. Outside, car horns echoed flatly through the rain. Maigret put on his overcoat, the heavy one, with the slightly frayed cuffs, and took his bowler from the rack by the door. He didn't tell Janvier or Lucas where he was going. He left no note. At the station, everything smelled like wet stone and train grease. Porters in navy blue moved slowly, pulling dollies stacked with cases wrapped in twine. A stray dog wandered near the café terrace, nose twitching. People passed Maigret without seeing him, couples returning from the provinces, clerks on early trains, a woman cradling a cat in a picnic basket. He didn't go to the ticket counters or the stationmaster's office. Instead, he walked to the far end of the platform, where the customs inspection booths stood empty between trains. A half-lit corridor, tiled in yellow and white, led to a waiting room used by the police. Fortin was there, a short, soft-spoken man with a narrow face and perpetually wet hair. He stood when Maigret entered. "You got the note, then," he said without greeting. Maigret took off his hat and shook the water from it. "Yes." "Tell me." Fortin hesitated, then gestured for Maigret to sit beside the heater. He came on the 7:20 from Milan. Nothing suspicious. Passport in order. Clothes pressed. Customs declaration impeccable. Italian shoes, French accent, small bag. And yet, something wasn't right. What kind of not right? Too good, Fortin said. Like he'd studied the part. A little too clean. When we asked his purpose of visit, he said it like he'd rehearsed it. Word for word. Even smiled at the end. What did he say? That he was here for a few days of rest and books. Staying at a pension near the Jardin des Plantes. Quiet. Maigret lit his pipe, the flame briefly illuminating the dark curl of his brow. You noted the address? Hotel Verviers. Rue Geoffroy Saint-Hilaire. Room 12. Maigret didn't ask why Fortin had thought to alert him. He already knew. Some things were born of instinct, and the men who worked the stations long enough. The border guards, the inspectors, the customs men, they developed an eye for the ordinary turn just slightly askew. He left Fortin with a nod and stepped back into the rain. The sky was still low and colorless. Across the river, a thin fog clung to the rooftops. The Rue Geoffroy Saint-Hilaire was narrow and uneven. The pension was 3 floors, painted once in a cheerful yellow that time and soot had dimmed. A potted plant, dead, hung beside the chipped doorbell. Maigret stood across the street and looked at it. There was no crime. No body. Not even a theft. Just a man too perfectly arrived. And yet, Maigret lingered. He would return later. Perhaps after dinner, after the guests had grown tired and careless. For now, he wanted to walk, past the botanical gardens, through the alleys behind the Museum of Natural History, where the city folded into itself like a tired old coat. There was something in the air, and not just the rain. Something was beginning. The Hotel Verviers had no lobby to speak of. Just a vestibule with cracked tiles and a wooden counter behind glass, where a balding man with an ink-stained ledger looked up with the expression of someone who had stopped expecting surprises long ago. Maigret didn't announce himself. He stood in the vestibule a moment, letting the wet smell of the street fade from his coat. The walls carried the must of old wallpaper, the kind that had once been floral but now looked like smoke-stained parchment. A bell rang softly as he stepped forward. "Bonsoir," said the clerk without rising. His accent was from Limoges, or perhaps deeper south, warm vowels, tired consonants. "I'm looking for a friend," Maigret said quietly. "He said he was staying here." "Foreign gentleman. Arrived this morning." The man scratched behind his ear with the end of a pen. He didn't look suspicious, merely uninterested. "We have a guest from Milan. Checked in early. Room 12. Would you mind?" Maigret gestured toward the stairs. "Just to be sure it's him." The clerk shrugged and reached under the counter for a key. "He said he didn't want to be disturbed," he added, almost as an afterthought. Maigret took the key and nodded. "I won't disturb him. Just want to see his face." The stairs creaked under his weight. Narrow, irregular, with a long brass handrail polished by decades of use. On the first landing, he passed a door left ajar. Inside, a woman sat in a threadbare robe, folding linens. She looked up without interest, then returned to her work. Room 12 was at the end of the second floor. The number was painted in black, slightly chipped. Maigret paused outside, listening. Nothing. Not even a radio or a chair shifting. He knocked once, gently. No response. With the slowness that was his habit, he inserted the key and opened the door a fraction. The room was modest, square, with a window that looked out over the sloped roofs behind the Jardin des Plantes. It smelled of soap, damp wool, and something else, the faint trace of cologne, expensive but subdued. There was a suitcase on the chair, a folded newspaper on the nightstand, and a man sitting on the bed, motionless, as though he'd been waiting for someone to arrive and had run out of patience just moments before. He looked up. His age was difficult to place, late 50s, perhaps early 60s, with hair that had been dark once but was now evenly peppered with gray. His eyes were steady, too steady, and the corners of his mouth were pressed into a faint smile, as though mocking his own surprise. "You're not hotel staff," he said after a pause. "No," Maigret replied, stepping inside and closing the door behind him. The man didn't rise. He sat with one leg crossed over the other, back straight. A thin scar ran from the base of his left earlobe to just under the jaw, not fresh, but not entirely forgotten. Maigret didn't offer a name, nor ask for his. "Do you mind if I sit?" "Be my guest," the man said, motioning to the chair by the desk. Maigret lowered himself carefully, lighting his pipe as he settled. He didn't speak at once. Instead, he watched the man as one watches a painting, quietly, letting the small details filter in. The man waited. "You arrived from Milan?" A small nod. "Yes." "Purpose of visit?" The man shrugged slightly. "Paris is pleasant in the spring. It's February." "True." Again, silence. Maigret exhaled a thin ribbon of smoke. "You're staying long?" "I haven't decided." "That's a very good passport you carry," Maigret said softly. The man didn't blink. "I should hope so. I paid enough for it." Maigret smiled, not at the words, but at the absence of defensiveness in the tone. The man wasn't nervous. Or if he was, he had long since learned to bury it beneath layers of control. "You're not police," the man said after a beat. "I am." There was no visible reaction. Only a slight adjustment of posture. "Am I suspected of something?" "No. Not yet." That brought a glint to the man's eye. Amusement? Disdain? Hard to say. "I'm not hiding," he said. "I checked in under my real name. I showed my documents. You can verify them." Maigret didn't move. "I intend to." The man unfolded himself from the bed slowly and crossed to the window. He looked out into the grey light for a moment, then turned back. "I'd prefer you do it quietly." Maigret said nothing. The man returned to his seat and clasped his hands together, resting them on one knee. "May I ask what drew your attention to me?" Maigret tapped the bowl of his pipe against the edge of the chair. "You looked too right. Like someone rehearsing being unnoticed." The man chuckled. "A compliment, of sorts." He reached into his coat pocket and produced a card, ivory, with a narrow black border and no decoration. It read: Hercule Poirot, Private Detective, Rue de Petit Champs, Paris. Maigret turned it in his hand. "A detective," he said. Poirot gave a modest nod. "Retired. Still carrying the cards, though. Old habits. One never knows." For a moment, something stirred beneath Maigret's impassive expression. Then he leaned forward slightly. "Why arrive by the 7:20 from Milan? It's direct. You didn't bring much." "I don't require much." "You didn't contact the police." "Should I have?" Maigret stood. His legs ached slightly from the cold. He offered the card back. "Keep it," Poirot said. "Perhaps you'll need it." Maigret placed the card in his pocket. "I may return," he said. "You seem the type." As he closed the door behind him, Maigret had the strange sense of having been interviewed, rather than the other way around. He walked slowly back down the stairs, the air thick with the scent of polish and stale cigarettes. Outside, the rain had stopped, but the street still gleamed. Somewhere behind the clouds, the light was fading. There was no crime yet. But Maigret had the unmistakable feeling of something having just shifted, like a curtain drawn back half an inch. He walked without direction, letting the streets guide him. The man in room 12 had not lied. But he hadn't told the truth, either. And Maigret, without knowing why, felt he had just met someone who carried too much silence behind the eyes. Tomorrow, he would begin asking questions. Tonight, he would walk, and let the questions form themselves. The following morning, the rain had returned. Not with the steady softness of yesterday, but with a more purposeful rhythm, pattering against the rooftops and running in rivulets down the narrow gutters of the Rue Geoffroy Saint-Hilaire. It was the kind of morning that made Parisians stay longer over their coffee, coats damp at the edges, umbrellas drying on hooks beside radiators. Maigret sat in a small café 2 streets down from the Hotel Verviers. The place had red-checked tablecloths and served thick coffee in chipped porcelain cups. He wasn't reading the newspaper in front of him, only pretending to. His eyes moved between the window and the steam rising from his cup. He wasn't thinking about crimes, not exactly. He was thinking about the quietness in room 12, the too careful way Poirot had moved, and most of all, about the absence of any real reason for the man to be in Paris. No meetings, no appointments, no clients, and yet, a tension in the air around him like the smell of metal before a thunderstorm. At 8:10, Maigret left a few coins on the table and stepped back into the street. The Hotel Verviers was already awake. A delivery boy was stacking bread by the kitchen door, and the same woman from yesterday was shaking out a faded rug onto the sidewalk, watching Maigret without interest as he passed. Inside, the clerk looked up from his ledger with that same expression, mild tolerance. "You're back," he said. "Not a question. Did our gentleman go out this morning?" The clerk shook his head. "Not yet. Haven't seen him. I'd like to have another look at his room." This time, the man hesitated. "He's paid until Friday." "I won't touch anything," Maigret said. "I just want to see what he's left behind." The clerk sighed and handed him the key again, this time without a word. Upstairs, the hallway smelled of cabbage and dust. He knocked. No answer. He waited a few seconds longer, then unlocked the door and stepped inside. The room was almost exactly as he remembered. The bed was made. Not by the staff, but by someone precise, with hospital corners and a fold in the blanket that looked practiced. The window was open a crack, letting in the scent of wet slate and chimney smoke. But something had changed. The suitcase was gone. Maigret moved slowly, methodically. The wardrobe held only a single gray overcoat. No shirts, no underthings, no shoes. The bathroom shelf was bare except for a toothbrush, brand new, and a tiny bar of soap from the hotel. There was no shaving kit, no comb, not even a towel hung out to dry. It was a room that suggested transience. Not even a book or a pen to indicate someone was staying longer than a single night. He opened the nightstand drawer. Empty. He bent to check under the bed. Nothing but dust and a coin from Belgium, left behind God knows when. He sat in the chair by the desk and looked around. The only clue to Poirot's presence was a folded paper on the table. Yesterday's Le Figaro, open to the society pages, and a small article about a Belgian diplomat attending a conference in Zurich. Maigret read it once, then again. No mention of Milan. No mention of Poirot. He turned the paper over and noticed a line penciled faintly in the margin, almost invisible. He always kept his passport under his pillow. The handwriting was unfamiliar. Careful, upright, almost too neat. Maigret walked to the bed and lifted the pillow. Nothing. But he did notice something odd. The pillow had no indentation. No impression from a head. It had been placed there, arranged, but clearly not used. He reached to the second pillow, same result. The bed had been made as a gesture, not after sleep, but for appearance. He returned to the chair and sat again. The rain tapped lightly on the glass behind him. So Poirot had either never slept here, or had taken great care to erase any sign that he had. And yet he had said he had come to rest. To read. To spend a few quiet days in Paris. There was nothing restful about room 12. Downstairs, Maigret returned the key. "Did anyone come to visit him yesterday?" he asked the clerk. "Not that I saw." "No calls?" "No. No messages?" The clerk opened a drawer, pulled out a thin bundle of folded slips, and leafed through them slowly. Then he paused. "There was one," he said. "I almost forgot. Delivered late in the afternoon by a boy. No stamp. No envelope." He handed it to Maigret. A square of cheap stationery, the kind sold at tobacco counters. In the same upright handwriting as the note in the newspaper, it read, "Be careful. You're not the only one looking." There was no signature. Did he respond to this? Maigret asked. I don't think so. He read it, folded it, and said nothing. Outside again, Maigret walked without hurry. He lit his pipe, shielding the flame from the rain, and began making his way toward the commissariat in the 5th arrondissement. He would make a few quiet inquiries. Nothing formal. Just see if anyone had registered a Belgian detective's arrival. Or if anyone had left a note at the border. Perhaps ask Janvier to look up old cases involving Poirot. The name sounded theatrical, almost too perfect, like the passport. In his years of working cases, Maigret had developed a deep suspicion of perfection. It was rarely real. And when it was, it often meant something had been erased. He passed a newsstand and bought a second copy of Le Figaro. The article about the diplomat was still there. Still irrelevant. Back at the Quai d'Orfèvres, he entered quietly through the side door. Lucas looked up from a stack of reports. You look like you've spent the night under a bridge, Lucas said. Maigret said nothing. He removed his coat, hung it on the stand, and placed the note on the desk. See if you can trace this handwriting, he said. And ask around if anyone's seen a man calling himself Hercule Poirot arrive from Milan. Lucas raised an eyebrow. Is this a new case? No, Maigret said softly. Not yet. He turned and looked out the rain-misted window, pipe unlit between his fingers. Across the city, a man was staying in a hotel room with no luggage, no shaving kit, and no past. And someone else was watching him. The puzzle wasn't complete. But a corner had just been found. The following day, the sun made a timid appearance, slipping through gaps in the clouds like someone testing whether it was safe to return. The streets were still slick with yesterday's rain, puddles reflecting gray stone buildings and bare trees. Paris was quieter on mornings like this, less hurried, more resigned. Even the trams seemed to move more slowly. Maigret arrived at the Quai d'Orfèvres earlier than usual. His coat was damp from the short walk across the Seine, and he took his time hanging it on the rack. Lucas was already at his desk, a half-eaten croissant balanced on a stack of folders. He looked up as Maigret entered. I've got something, he said, brushing crumbs from his jacket. About your mystery guest. Maigret moved to the stove, filled the enamel kettle, and placed it on the flame before turning. Lucas continued. No official record of anyone named Hercule Poirot arriving from Milan. No customs entry. No flag on the passport either. It scans as real, but it's too clean. No stamps but the last one. Which is strange, people like that usually travel more often. Maigret lit his pipe slowly. And the handwriting? Preliminary analysis suggests it was written by a woman. Educated. Swiss-style cursive, the rounded kind they teach in Zurich. We're still checking against samples from the embassy. Maigret nodded once, slowly. Anything else? Lucas hesitated. We did find a mention of that name, Hercule Poirot, in an old Interpol memo. It was more than a decade ago. No photo. Just a line, reported in Antwerp under that alias. Possible connection to a forgery ring. Maigret tapped the stem of his pipe against his lip. Alias, he repeated. Lucas lowered his voice. You think he's here to disappear? Or to make someone else disappear? That, Maigret said, is what I don't know yet. He poured hot water into a chipped mug, stirred in too much sugar, and drank it standing. Then he took his coat again. Where to? Lucas asked. Maigret didn't answer. He made his way to the Hotel Verviers once more, walking slowly along the edge of the Jardin des Plantes. The iron fence still held a trace of last night's dew. He stopped once to light his pipe, his match flaring in the pale daylight, then continued. At the hotel, the same clerk was at the desk, his sleeves rolled up, fingers smudged with ink. "Still here?" he said, not unkindly. "Did our friend receive any more messages?" Maigret asked. The clerk opened the drawer. "No." "Did he go out this morning?" "Just before 7. Walked south." "No luggage." "Still hasn't returned." Maigret nodded and turned, but the clerk called after him. "There was someone asking for him last night." "A woman." Maigret turned back slowly. "What kind of woman?" "Refined." "Quiet." "Swiss, maybe." "She asked if Mr. Poirot was in. I told her he was out. She left no name." "Did she seem nervous?" The clerk thought for a moment. "No. Calm. But not casual. She looked over her shoulder when she left." "Did you notice anything else?" "She was carrying a book," the clerk said. "Not a handbag. Just a book. And she didn't speak much." Maigret took a few coins from his pocket and laid them gently on the desk. "If she comes back, call this number." He left a card with Lucas's direct line and walked out. He didn't know where he was going, but his feet carried him east. Down the Rue Poliveau, across the Boulevard de l'Hôpital, and into the quieter lanes beyond. He passed a small bookshop just before the Rue Jenner and paused. It wasn't unusual, just one of those tucked-away places with crooked shelves and second-hand copies in the window. But something about it made him step inside. A bell rang above the door. The shop smelled of mildew, old paper, and furniture polish. A woman behind the counter looked up. She was in her mid-40s, perhaps older, with pale eyes and a manner that was at once polite and guarded. Her sweater had a small hole near the collar, and her fingers bore faint ink stains. Maigret removed his hat and nodded. "Good morning." She returned the greeting. "I'm looking for a woman who may have passed this way last night," he said. "Slim. Dark coat. Carrying a book." The woman's eyes narrowed slightly. "Many people carry books, monsieur. She's not from here. Possibly Swiss. Mid-50s. Did anyone fitting that description come in?" The bookseller hesitated. Then, yes. Briefly. Around 6. Did she buy something? No. She asked if we carried La Mort est mon métier. I told her we didn't. She left. Maigret nodded. Thank you. As he turned to leave, she added, she didn't browse. Just asked. As if the book itself mattered more than the shop. Outside again, Maigret walked a few paces, then stopped and looked up. Across the street was a small café, nearly empty. He took a seat near the window and ordered a beer. The pieces were slow to come. A man who arrives with nothing, but too much precision. A woman who looks for him but leaves no name. A book she doesn't buy. A passport with too few stamps. A name too carefully chosen. He sat for over an hour, thinking. Letting the quiet help him listen. Then he returned to the Quai d'Orfèvres and called a contact at the Swiss consulate. I'm looking for a woman, he said. Educated. From Zurich. Possibly involved in art, law, or international affairs. Mid-50s. Maybe traveling under another name. The voice on the other end sighed. You've just described half our embassy. Maigret chuckled softly. This one leaves no trace. There was silence. Let me ask around, the voice said. I'll call you tomorrow. That night, Maigret returned home late. Madame Maigret had left his supper warming on the stove, cabbage soup and a small loaf of black bread. She was already in her chair, knitting something blue and shapeless. "You look tired," she said. "I feel watched," he replied. She didn't ask by whom. Instead, she poured him a glass of white wine and returned to her knitting. Maigret sat at the table, the soup warming his fingers. He didn't eat right away. Just stared out the window into the darkening sky. Someone was playing a long game. A game with no noise. And he had just stepped into it. The next morning brought a brittle chill to the air, the kind that didn't come from wind or frost but from the silence that often settled over Paris just before something broke loose. Maigret rose earlier than usual. He didn't shave, only splashed water on his face and buttoned his collar unevenly before taking the stairs down to the street. Madame Maigret, still in her robe, watched him go without a word. She had learned to read his silences better than most. By the time he arrived at the Quai d'Orfèvres, Lucas had already poured the coffee, the bitter, scorched kind from the corner percolator that tasted mostly of metal and habit. Maigret took it gratefully and leaned on the desk. "Any word from Zurich?" Lucas nodded. "Just came in. No one matching your woman's description formally declared at the embassy. But an attaché named Elaine Rube did go missing from her post 4 days ago. She hasn't reported in. The Swiss authorities haven't raised alarm, she'd requested extended leave citing personal reasons. But something in the phrasing struck our contact as odd." Maigret rubbed the rim of his cup slowly with his thumb. "And? She was last seen in Milan. No record of her arriving in Paris." "Milan," Maigret repeated. "That again." He stood, walked to the window, and stared at the grey morning. "Milan sends us a man with a too clean passport. Now it sends us a woman who doesn't exist on paper." Lucas set down another folder. "I also had Janvier check the name Hercule Poirot. Thoroughly this time. And? There is no such man." "Meaning?" "Meaning, the name appears in outdated hotel registries in Brussels, on a few faded business cards in private detective directories that no longer operate, and once in a letter to an editor of a Belgian newspaper, signed, but never verified. Each mention is self-referential. A shadow playing in its own light." Maigret said nothing. Lucas added, "We found no trace of the man ever being licensed in France. Or Belgium. Or Italy. No tax records, no birth certificate, no professional accreditation. If he exists, he lives only in fragments." The kettle hissed. No one moved to pour more. Maigret finally spoke. "Then perhaps he wants to be seen. Just not understood." He left the office without finishing his coffee. Outside, the city was beginning to stir. The flower carts were being rolled into place on Rue de la Cite, and the first customers waited at the boulangerie beside the river. Maigret took the tram to the left bank, standing near the rear door and watching his own reflection blur across the glass as rain began to fall again, soft this time, like before. He arrived at the Hotel Verviers a little after 9. The clerk was not at the desk. In his place was a younger woman with tired eyes and a heavy sweater that didn't quite fit. "Is Monsieur Poirot in?" Maigret asked. She blinked slowly. "No one by that name is registered here. I know he didn't use the name officially. I'm asking if the man in room 12 is still staying here." She hesitated. Room 12 was vacated this morning. Before 6. The key was left on the counter. "Did he take anything with him?" She shrugged. "There was nothing to take." "No message?" "No." Maigret stood for a moment, absorbing the stillness of it. Then he turned toward the stairs without asking. The woman didn't stop him. Room 12 was clean. Not tidied, clean. The bed remade. The window opened just enough to let the chill in. There was no newspaper this time, no faint scent of cologne, no trace of anyone ever having spent the night. Only a single item remained on the nightstand, a matchbox from a hotel in Lugano. Folded inside was a slip of paper. He opened it carefully. The handwriting was the same. He wasn't supposed to come back. If he does, don't let him remember. He read it twice. Then again. The pronouns bent in too many directions. Downstairs, he left without speaking and walked until his feet brought him near the Jardin des Plantes again. Across from the gates, a brass plaque marked a small guest house, discreet, well-kept, quiet. He remembered it from years ago. A place for foreign guests who didn't want to be seen. Inside, he asked the woman at the desk if anyone matching Poirot's description had made inquiries. No, she said, after flipping through a thin register. But we did receive a phone call 3 days ago from Milan. The woman asked about availability. Gave no name. Did she have an accent? French. But clipped. Like someone trying not to sound like herself. He thanked her and stepped outside again. It was all drifting. Names that weren't names, people who vanished as quietly as they appeared, notes passed in hotel rooms that dissolved before the ink dried. He returned to the office, coat damp again. Lucas looked up. I'm starting to think he came to Paris to erase something, Maigret said. Lucas tilted his head. Or to be erased. There was a pause. The kind that settles in after the first real shape of a mystery begins to show itself. We need to find out who he was before he became Hercule Poirot, Maigret said. Lucas was already opening a drawer. Janvier's looking into old Belgian census rolls. It'll take time. Good. Let it take time. Maigret lowered himself into his chair, pipe unlit in his mouth, staring at the ceiling. A memory came back to him, not of a case, but of a train ride long ago, when he had seen a man on a bench reading a newspaper upside down. When asked why, the man had said it helped him see patterns others missed. He had thought the man mad. Now, he wasn't so sure. The passport was too perfect. The name too well worn. The room too clean. And somewhere, a woman from Zurich had left her identity behind like a coat she no longer needed. He thought of the note again. Don't let him remember. Which meant someone feared that he might. That evening, the wind picked up. It wasn't violent, only persistent. The kind that curled around chimneys and slipped under doorways, carrying with it the smell of wet stone and rusted iron from the river. Maigret had been sitting in the same chair for nearly an hour, eyes unfocused, listening more than thinking. In the outer office, Lucas and Janvier spoke in low voices. A teletype machine clicked occasionally, followed by a burst of silence. The building at Quai d'Orfèvres had a way of amplifying certain sounds and swallowing others. Footsteps rang. Whispers disappeared. It had always been that way. Maigret stood up slowly, stretched his legs, and walked to the window. The lamps along the Seine were beginning to glow, casting thin reflections in the water. A barge drifted past, almost invisible in the dusk, its motor humming like a distant bee. Lucas tapped on the frame. There's someone here to see you. Maigret turned. She wouldn't give her name, Lucas added. Says it's personal. Maigret gave a small nod. Send her in. She entered quietly. The door clicked shut behind her with a softness that seemed intentional. She wore a navy coat and no makeup, her hair gathered into a modest twist that revealed the sharpness of her cheekbones. She could have been 50, perhaps younger, though something in her bearing, the poise, the calm, made her feel older. Maigret gestured to the chair opposite his desk. She didn't sit. You're looking for the man calling himself Hercule Poirot, she said. Her accent confirmed it, Swiss-French, just as he had imagined. Carefully neutral. I am, Maigret replied. And I believe you know him. I did. In what capacity? She hesitated. It's not that simple. Maigret said nothing. He walked slowly to the stove, opened the grate, and added 2 small logs. The crackle filled the silence between them. At last, she sat. "He was a friend of my husband's," she began. "Years ago. Before the war. They worked together, intelligence, border surveillance. Quiet work, discreet. Nothing heroic." "Your husband's name?" "Martin Roog." Maigret didn't write it down. "I was younger. I didn't understand all the rules then. What could be spoken aloud, what couldn't. They had a circle of sorts, 6 or 7 of them. Not a formal agency, more of a shared understanding. One handled documents, another managed crossings, one in France, one in Belgium, one in Zurich. They called it the corridor." "And your husband?" "Died in 43. A quiet death, they said. But the kind that follows a decision someone else made." She looked at Maigret now, directly. "He had papers. Names. Old identities. One of them was Poirot." Maigret watched her closely. "But it wasn't your husband's name." "No. It was someone else's. Someone who disappeared. After the war, no one asked questions. People like that were allowed to dissolve. But now he's back." She nodded slowly. "Or someone wearing the shape of him." "What do you believe?" She didn't answer at first. Then, "I believe something was buried and is trying to surface." Maigret exhaled. The stove was beginning to warm the room. "Do you know what he's doing here?" "No. But I know he shouldn't be." She reached into her coat and handed him something. A photograph. A black and white snapshot, faded around the edges, of 5 men standing outside a villa. 2 of them were smiling. The others weren't. Maigret studied their faces. None matched the man he'd met in room 12 exactly, but one, the second from the left, could have been him if you softened the lines and added time. "Taken in Lugano," she said. "Summer of 1938. Before it all went bad." Maigret looked again at the man in the middle. His stance, his expression, it wasn't one of fear. It was detachment. A kind of observation that didn't quite belong to the others. "Do you know where he is now?" he asked her. She looked away. "He's afraid." "Not of you. Of what he may have said. Or will say." "And why did you come to me?" She stood again. This time, slower. Like the gravity in the room had grown heavier. "I thought if he told you something, it would be safe there. With someone who wouldn't use it carelessly. He hasn't told me anything. Not yet." She placed a second paper on his desk, a folded map of Paris with a single address circled, a small café in the 14th arrondissement, just south of Montparnasse. "He asked me to meet him there 2 nights from now. Will you?" "I haven't decided." Maigret nodded. "Leave the decision open. If you go, I may be there as well." She walked toward the door, then paused. "Inspector," she said without turning, "not everyone who disappears does so to escape guilt. Some vanish because they once protected something too well." Then she was gone. Maigret sat down and looked again at the photograph. He studied the 5 faces, their arrangement, the distance between them. He didn't know which man Hercule Poirot truly was. But he knew now, this was not a case of mistaken identity. It was a case of remembered danger. The confession had already begun, it just hadn't been heard. Not fully. Not yet. It rained again the next day. Not the sudden downpour that causes people to curse and scatter, but a long, unhurried drizzle that blanketed the city in a kind of muffled patience. It softened the noises of Paris, the tram bells, the footfalls, even the morning voices in cafés, until everything seemed half submerged, as if underwater. Maigret walked without an umbrella. His collar turned up, hat low over his eyes, he moved slowly through the 14th arrondissement, past shuttered bookstores and damp awnings, toward the address the woman had circled on the map. He hadn't seen her again. Hadn't expected to. People like her said only what they were willing to risk, and no more. The café sat on a quiet corner where Rue de la Grande Chaumière curved gently toward the cemetery walls. Its name, Le Villam, was painted in fading blue across the windows. A striped canopy sagged under the weight of the rain, and a narrow wooden door creaked as Maigret pushed it open. Inside, it smelled of espresso, wet wool, and the faint citrus of polished tables. Only 3 patrons sat in the entire place, 2 older men playing cards near the back, and a woman with a yellow scarf bent over a magazine she wasn't reading. The waiter behind the zinc counter looked up without interest. Maigret chose a corner table with a view of the door and ordered a coffee he didn't want. The waiter brought it wordlessly and walked away. He waited. Not for the woman, not yet, but for something else. A shift in the air, a look exchanged, a sound that didn't belong. He lit his pipe and let it go out. Lit it again. His eyes flicked across the room, the chipped tile near the window, the sugar bowl on the adjacent table, the drip of rain running down a coat left on a hook. Small details. Quiet ones. He waited for over an hour. Then, at 10:30, the door opened with the same long creak. The man who entered was neither rushed nor tentative. He moved with the weary precision of someone accustomed to watching who else is watching. The coat was different. Brown this time, with a subtle check, but the eyes were the same. Still too calm. Still too alert. Maigret didn't move. Poirot, or the man calling himself that, scanned the room without lingering and made his way to the table directly opposite Maigret. He didn't seem surprised. "You came early," Poirot said softly. "I've always preferred waiting to apologizing," Maigret replied. A faint smile. "She won't come, you know." "No." They sat in silence for a moment. The rain whispered against the windowpanes. "I saw the photograph," Maigret said. Poirot raised one eyebrow. "Then you know everything." "I know nothing," Maigret answered. "Just that you were someone else once." Poirot shrugged. "Aren't we all?" "No," Maigret said. "Most people never learn how." The man leaned forward slightly. "Then you know more than you say." Maigret didn't respond. He reached into his coat and placed the folded note on the table. "The one from room 12, the one that read, 'Don't let him remember.'" Poirot glanced at it, unread. "I expected worse. What are you trying to remember?" For the first time, the man hesitated. Then, very slowly, he said, "I'm not here to remember. I'm here to see if forgetting still holds." They sat there, the words suspended between them. Maigret studied him again. The way he held his hands, the slight tremor he tried to hide in the right one, the way he kept his left foot slightly behind the chair leg as if ready to stand without warning. "You've been here before," Maigret said. Poirot didn't answer. But the pause confirmed it. "Did you know Martin Rogue is dead?" "Of course," Poirot said quietly. "We all knew. We just waited to say it." "And the woman?" A shadow passed over Poirot's expression, but he didn't flinch. "She was the only one who kept the records. Everyone else trusted words. She trusted paper. And you trusted her?" "I trusted her to protect the truth. Until it began to rot." Maigret leaned back, his chair creaking. "So now you've come back to destroy what's left?" Poirot shook his head slowly. "No, Inspector. I've come back because I may have already done it." The words settled between them, dense and final. Maigret didn't write them down. He knew they wouldn't matter in any report. "Who were you before the name?" he asked softly. Poirot looked toward the window. The rain had slowed, replaced by a thin mist that hovered like smoke above the pavement. "I had several names," he said. "One in Antwerp. One in Lausanne. One in the border towns where no one asked too many questions. But they were all pieces of the same silence. And now? Now I'm just waiting to see who speaks first." They sat in quiet again, until Poirot stood. He left a coin on the table. Not for the coffee, he hadn't ordered anything, but as a gesture. Then he turned toward the door. "Where are you staying?" Maigret asked, though he knew he wouldn't get an answer. Poirot paused. "Somewhere without mirrors." He stepped out into the mist. Maigret didn't follow. He sat there for a long time, watching the ripple left in the air by the door's closing. The man hadn't confessed. But perhaps he never needed to. Because some crimes aren't committed in action, but in what one chooses to forget, and then chooses, deliberately, to recall. The next morning, Maigret stood beneath the overhang of a shuttered tobacco shop in the 18th arrondissement, watching the rain begin again, this time in broad, slanting strokes that swept across the empty intersection like stage curtains. He hadn't gone to the office. Not yet. There was nothing official to report, and nothing official to pursue. But something compelled him to continue. Not an order. Not even curiosity. Something quieter than that. A thread that hadn't stopped tugging. He lit his pipe and waited for the tram that would take him to Gare de l'Est. When it came, he climbed aboard without speaking. The conductor didn't ask for a ticket. The city was full of ghosts this morning, and Maigret had learned how to move among them. At the station, he bought a lukewarm coffee and boarded the early train to Metz. A man in a grey overcoat sat across from him, reading a sports paper without turning the page. 2 stops later, a group of students boarded with damp scarves and impatient laughter. Maigret barely noticed. His eyes rested on the blur of passing fields, fences, and thin trees stripped bare by February. He got off at a minor junction 20 kilometers before the border. From there, a bus took him into a village no larger than a postage stamp, the kind that survives by forgetting it exists. There was 1 inn, 2 cafes, and a customs post that hadn't seen real traffic since the war ended. He knew this place. He had been here once, years ago, chasing a smuggler who had vanished not by distance but by routine. The streets hadn't changed. Neither had the smell of coal smoke or the chipped enamel signs advertising petrol no one sold anymore. The border post sat at the edge of a long, narrow road lined with poplars. The guard's hut had peeling paint, and the French flag hung limp against the mast. Inside, a single officer sat with his feet on a crate, radio playing low. When Maigret entered, the man straightened. "Inspector Maigret," he said, blinking in surprise. "It's been years." "You have a good memory," Maigret replied. "You don't forget the ones who don't shout." Maigret nodded and took the stool opposite him. "I need to ask about an old entry. A man, traveling under the name Hercule Poirot. From Milan. Arrived 3 days ago. Tall, formal, quiet." The officer scratched his cheek. "I remember him. Did anything seem strange?" The officer leaned back, remembering. Everything was correct. Too correct. Papers clean. Shoes too polished for train travel. No luggage, just a single envelope he never opened. He passed through without a word, nodded at the right moments, smiled when asked his purpose of visit. Did he give one? Rest and study. The kind of answer people think sounds harmless. Anything else? The officer hesitated. He asked for directions. Not to a town. Not to a person. To a church. A church? The man nodded. one just across the border. Abandoned. Old place from the 12th century. Locals say it was used during the war, mostly for storage, sometimes for things better left unsaid. Maigret stood. Can you show me? The officer grabbed his coat. It's a few minutes by car. I'll take you. They drove in silence, the landscape unfolding in slow, gray layers. The rain had eased but left everything slick and darkened, the fields shining like slate. After 10 minutes, the road narrowed and curved around a wooded rise. There, standing slightly sunken in the earth, was the church. It had no spire, just a bell tower half collapsed and a door hanging slightly ajar. Ivy clung to the stones like old regrets. The officer stayed in the car while Maigret approached. Inside, it was darker than he expected. The air smelled of damp plaster, mold, and burned wax. Pews were stacked against one wall, and shattered glass littered the tiled floor near the broken windows. At the far end, where the altar would have been, stood a plain wooden table. On it, a single object, a folded map. Unmarked, unsealed. He opened it slowly. It was a topographical rendering of the Swiss-Italian border. Tiny notes in the same careful handwriting marked 3 locations. Each name had been underlined once, lightly. Next to one, a single phrase, what they buried was never theirs to keep. Maigret folded the map and slipped it into his coat. There was no other sign of life in the church, no food, no bedding, no paper trail. Just the echo of the man's presence, faint as a breath on a window. Back at the customs post, the officer poured them both coffee from a dented thermos. He's hiding something, the officer said, not as a question. Maigret nodded. Or protecting it. They're not always the same thing. No. But sometimes they rhyme. He thanked the man and made his way back to the station by foot. The walk took almost an hour, and by the time he reached the platform, the wind had picked up again. He pulled his coat tighter and sat on a bench beneath a leaning iron lamp. As the train arrived, he glanced back once, toward the road and the trees beyond. There was nothing there. But the silence remained. Back in Paris, the streets were beginning to darken. Lucas met him at the office with a quiet expression. There's more, Lucas said. Maigret removed his coat without asking. We traced the name Martin Roug through some old embassy records. In 1946, just after the war, he was part of a task force investigating the movement of falsified documents through neutral territories. Switzerland? Yes. And parts of northern Italy. Border towns. He was involved with people who had access to exit papers, forged passports, citizenship certificates. And? Lucas handed him a list. One of the aliases he flagged in his reports, years before he died, was Hercule Poirot. Maigret looked down at the page. The name wasn't invented after the fact. It had been used for years. Carefully. Deliberately. Worn like a mask passed from one face to another. Someone hadn't assumed an identity. They had inherited it. Maigret said nothing. But in his mind, the pieces began to shift. The careful smile. The missing suitcase. The abandoned church. The woman who had trusted only in paper. And the man who arrived too perfectly, not to hide, but to ensure a version of the past remained buried. The rain had tapered off by the time Maigret returned to the city, but the streets still shimmered with a dull sheen, slick with memory. Paris always wore water well, its stones darker, its secrets a little closer to the surface. Dusk had fallen by the time he crossed Pont Saint-Michel, and the fog from the river curled along the edges of the quay like smoke from a dying fire. He didn't return to the Quai d'Orfèvres. Not yet. Instead, he followed a quiet instinct, one that didn't come from any file or whisper, but from something more personal, pattern, rhythm, silence. The man calling himself Poirot hadn't vanished. He had simply shifted again, like a figure in a mirror who no longer matches your reflection. Maigret found himself walking down Rue Claude Bernard, toward the eastern edge of the Latin Quarter. The buildings here were older, more anonymous, the names of shops faded and paint curling at the edges of forgotten facades. At the end of the street, beneath a rusted archway, was a side door with no number and a small brass plate so worn it was illegible. It had been a pension once, then a bookstore, then something else entirely. Maigret remembered investigating a death here, many years ago. A man found hanging in a stairwell, though everyone insisted he never went upstairs. He pressed the bell and waited. A soft buzz released the door. Inside, the air was thick with old varnish and dust. A narrow hallway stretched ahead, lined with yellowed wallpaper and wooden pegs where coats once hung. He passed a shut door to his right. Another stood open to reveal a dim sitting room with threadbare armchairs, a small fireplace, and a single lamp casting its glow over a stack of magazines from another decade. At the back of the hall, a woman sat behind a desk. Her age was hard to determine, somewhere between retirement and memory. She wore a cardigan with one button missing and had the quiet manner of someone who preferred silence to company. "Bonsoir," Maigret said, removing his hat. She nodded in return but said nothing. "I'm looking for a guest," he continued. "Tall man. Gray coat. Clean shoes. Checked in 2 nights ago under a name that isn't real." Her expression didn't change. She simply looked at him for a long moment before rising. Without a word, she turned and opened a small drawer beneath the desk. She pulled out a narrow leather book, an old register, and flipped to the most recent entries. Her finger landed on a name, Paul André. Room 6. No address. No phone number. Paid in cash. She closed the book and looked up at Maigret. "He's downstairs," she said finally. "Downstairs?" She nodded again. "We don't rent that room, not anymore." But he asked for something quiet. Did he say why? No. Just that he needed a place no one would look for him. "And you agreed?" Her mouth twitched slightly. "He said he'd stayed here before. In another time." Maigret followed her down a narrow staircase behind the desk, one he hadn't noticed. It creaked with every step, the smell of old stone and damp earth growing stronger with each level. At the bottom was a corridor with only one door. The woman knocked once, then opened it. Inside, the light was dim and warm. A single oil lamp sat on a writing desk, illuminating a bed, a chair, and a suitcase. This time, not empty. Against the far wall was a bookshelf containing 3 volumes, each placed with deliberate care. The room was not austere. It was remembered. As if someone had rebuilt a memory out of wood, paper, and habit. The man was sitting in the chair, reading. He looked up as Maigret entered but did not rise. "I thought it might be you." Maigret removed his coat and sat on the edge of the bed. "No mirrors in here either," he said. Poirot gave the faintest smile. "You've been busy." "You never really left," Maigret replied. "Only changed your position. And yet I'm still waiting." "For what?" Poirot closed the book and placed it gently on the desk. "For someone to tell me I'm not needed anymore." Maigret studied him. "You're not here to be caught." "No." "You're not here to confess." "No." "You're here, to watch it end." A long pause. Poirot looked down at his hands. "I carried that name for 20 years. Before the war. After. It passed through border towns, train compartments, embassies, and hotel lobbies. Each time a little cleaner than the last." "You weren't the only one," Maigret said. "I know. That's what made it work." They sat in silence, the soft hiss of the lamp filling the space between words. Martin Rogue marked you, Maigret continued. Not just the name. The man you were before. He knew. Poirot's eyes lifted. He knew all of us. He knew the weight of invention. That's why he started writing it down. And the others? Gone. One disappeared into Argentina. Another drank himself into a pension in Naples. One married a widow in Saint Gervais and hasn't left her side since. And the woman? She left herself behind. Poirot nodded. She always knew it would end like this, he said. In fragments. In small rooms. Not with arrests or headlines. Just silence. Maigret pulled the folded map from his pocket and placed it on the desk. You left this in the church. Poirot looked at it but didn't touch it. It wasn't for me. Then for who? For the person who still thinks this can be sorted. Maigret said nothing for a long moment. You could walk out now, he said finally. There's no one chasing you. I know. You could take a train, cross another border, become someone else. I've done that too many times. And this? Poirot smiled, not sadly, not triumphantly, just plainly. This is the last version of myself I know how to be. Maigret stood and placed his hat under his arm. You'll stay? Until the silence is finished. The two men looked at each other for the length of a breath. Then Maigret turned and made his way back up the stairs, his footsteps soft against the creaking wood. Outside, the night had thickened. The fog had returned, curling through the alleyways, veiling the lamps, softening the outlines of the city. He didn't hurry. There was nothing urgent to pursue. Only a fading echo of a man who had learned how to disappear while staying still. Back at home, Madame Maigret had left a small bowl of soup warming on the stove. She was already asleep. He sat at the table, letting the silence settle around him. Down below, in the room beneath the city, a man waited to be forgotten. And Maigret, without entirely knowing why, allowed him to remain. 3 mornings passed. During that time, Maigret said nothing about the man in the room beneath the pension. He filed no report, made no inquiries, and gave no instructions to Lucas or Janvier. He let the city move around him, the usual calls, the usual noise, the drip of routine cases that came and went like passing weather. But in his mind, something stayed very still. The sound of footsteps down a narrow stair. A quiet voice saying, until the silence is finished. On the 4th day, a small envelope arrived at the Quai d'Orfèvres. It was unremarkable in every way, cream-colored, unsealed, no return address, and might have been discarded by any secretary had it not been addressed in faint, precise handwriting to Chief Inspector Jules Maigret, Quai d'Orfèvres, Paris. Inside was a single object. A torn portion of an envelope, yellowed with age, bearing a Swiss postmark dated April 17, 1946. The letter itself was gone. But 3 words were still legible beneath the tear: he remembers everything. Maigret stared at the scrap for a long time. He didn't need to be told who had sent it. And he didn't need the rest of the letter to understand what it once contained. He walked to the window, pipe cold between his fingers, and watched a woman outside trying to light a cigarette beneath a tilted umbrella. The lighter failed once, then again. She gave up, placed the cigarette behind her ear, and moved on. He called for Lucas. Do we still have the Rogue files? Lucas nodded. In the archives. Box 74 Delta. Bottom shelf. Have Janvier pull them. Quietly. Lucas gave him a searching look. Something we should know? Maigret shook his head. Just paper ghosts. An hour later, the files were on his desk, Warara communications, memos, carbon copies of old embassy reports. Names mostly lost to time. But they painted a picture. falsified exit permits. Temporary identities issued through dead consulates. Pockets of men who moved between roles, disappearing just before being noticed. The name Hercule Poirot surfaced 3 times, always linked to a different nationality, always tied to travel from one controlled border to another. The last mention was scribbled in the margin of a memo, used again, and too neatly. Suggest observation if it reappears. No one had followed up. He closed the file. That afternoon, he returned to the pension. The same woman was behind the desk, same cardigan, same tired eyes. She greeted him with a simple nod. "I've come to check on your guest," he said. She didn't ask who. "He left this morning," she said. "Paid in cash." Said nothing. Maigret didn't ask for the room key. He walked straight down the stairs. The door to the basement room stood open. Inside, the oil lamp was cold. The bed was made. The suitcase gone. The bookshelf stood empty now, except for one item. A glass paperweight. He picked it up. It was unremarkable, a flattened dome with a swirl of blue inside. But beneath it, pressed carefully between 2 layers of dust, was a square of folded tracing paper. He unfolded it slowly. It was a sketch. A border crossing. A wooden hut. A narrow bridge flanked by poplars. And 2 figures, barely outlined, facing away from the viewer. One tall. The other stooped, with a walking cane. At the bottom, in faint pencil, only one of them crossed. He slipped the sketch into his coat pocket. Above, in the empty hallway, the bell at the pension door rang. A voice called down. "Inspector?" Maigret climbed the stairs. A delivery boy stood at the counter holding a brown paper package. He handed it over, nodded once, and left without waiting for a tip. Maigret turned it over. No name. Inside was a book, well-worn, French binding, spine cracked and pages underlined in blue pencil. It was a detective novel. Not one he knew. Published in Zurich in 1951. On the first page, a name written in faded ink, M. Rug. He turned to the final chapter. A man flees across a border. Not because he's guilty, but because he's become the last keeper of a lie that no longer protects anyone. In the last paragraph, he leaves behind his false identity, folds it into a coat pocket, and steps onto a train alone. Maigret closed the book. Back at the Quai d'Orfèvres, he wrote a single-page memo and placed it in a folder marked Miscellaneous, closed. Subject, Hercule Poirot, alias, status, inactive. Location, unknown. Recommendation, no further pursuit. He signed it with his usual scrawl and filed it under a drawer no one visited unless asked. That evening, he walked home along the Quai des Grands Augustins. The lamps were lit early. The rain had not returned, but the sky remained bruised with the memory of it. A man was playing violin near Pont Neuf, something slow and melancholy that suited the silence. When he arrived, Madame Maigret was stirring soup on the stove. She looked up. "Another long day?" "No," he said, removing his coat. "Just a long story." She smiled and placed the bowls on the table. Outside, the city continued its gentle forgetting. And somewhere, not far, not near, a man walked with a name that had never belonged to him, into a future that no longer required one.